start. Let's dive in with our blessing over Torah. Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai-dai. 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 Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, הפוך בה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, ידעי, ידעי, yada. Okay, good. It is working. So let me share my screen because today we are going to be looking at one of everyone's favorite Torah portions of the entire year, right? The Torah portion of Mitzvah, which of course is all about a skin disease. Actually, it's not even just a skin disease. It's a disease that is a skin disease as well as like objects can actually have this disease. Houses can have it. Inanimate objects can have it. This very, very contagious something called sarat. And in our portion, all right. Trying to find the screen that shows it. Okay. My computer is not letting me share this. I will keep on working on it as I talk. This portion, we are going to be focused really on what this idea of embarrassment or shame that comes along with sin. Wow. And so see, maybe now it'll let me share it. Okay, there we go. Now it's working. So really, in order to start diving in, and we're not going to be talking about this particular Torah portion, like a big part of this Torah portion, we're just going to be talking about small snippets in order to talk about the overwhelming kind of idea in Musar of busha, of shame or embarrassment, and how that's a soul trait. So in order to start this conversation, and even in our commentary for today, if you had a chance to look at it, they referenced some of these early texts from the book of Genesis. And this is really when Adam and Eve are in the tree, or are in the Garden of Eden. It's before they eat from the tree of knowledge. And the text says, the two of them were naked, the human and his wife, yet they felt no shame. And right now, before they ate from the tree of knowledge, there's an idea, and you can see there, bosha, the Hebrew word for anyone who can read Hebrew, that idea of shame or embarrassment. They didn't feel any of that as they were walking around in the Garden of Eden. But shortly thereafter, in the next chapter, it says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for eating and a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they perceived that they were naked. And they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. They heard the sound of God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day, and the human and his wife hid from God among the trees of the garden. God called out to the human and said to him, "Where are you?" He replied, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." So why do you think in this first text it says that there was no shame, but here there's hiding that's going on? Here they're acting like, what do you make of this kind of idea of busha, shame, and how it appears in the story of Adam and Eve?
Wow.
I'll go. I say, I feel that the tree, the whole symbolization, whatever the context of it is that we learned like how to be aware of ourselves more than others or God. That's what I think. That's where it starts. Like we started, the eat of that tree was to learn more, to worry more about myself than others. And I think that's why they were so ashamed and hid and didn't want to be seen, because they started to think, oh my God, I don't look good anymore. Or, and they started thinking about themselves and not others or God.
So there's a kind of awareness that's going on. They're perceiving themselves through others' eyes, perhaps. Yeah, Jessica, please. Oh, you're muted though, Jessica. We can't hear you yet.
Frank beat me to it, but I was going to say that. But I also want to point out that the human says, I was afraid. And so this element of fear, I think, is really interesting. I mean, does fear go along with self-awareness? It certainly does go along with shyness, which is, I think, an acute sense of self-awareness, because you're afraid of what people are going to think of you. And does this mean the human was afraid of God already?
It's a really good question. What were they afraid of exactly that they felt the need to hide?
Maybe this is the first time anyone ever had a sense of right and wrong.
So in eating from the tree of knowledge, all of a sudden now there's all sorts of moral pieces that they're becoming aware of and don't quite know what to do with.
Well, and as they approached it, there was a yes and a no, and they chose no.
So let's look at what Rabbi Samuel Rose says about all of this, because he puts a commentary out based on these texts. And he says the character trait, the midah of shame, according to Rabbi Hirsch, is God's gift of grace to humanity. Really interesting. Busha is God's gift of grace to humanity. God instilled in each person's heart a sense of shame. God knew that a person would not always measure up to what he, she, they were meant to be. Therefore, God implanted within each person a sense of shame, which would always inform the person of their inadequacy. Thus, everyone became their own monitor and guardian. However, just because human beings were granted this gift of shame, it should not be taken for granted. Orot Tzadikim encourages human beings to exert themselves, to conduct themselves in accordance with this noble trait, and employ wisdom in cultivating it until it is implanted in their souls. Because the trait of shame is a great fence and an iron barrier against all transgressions. So the way that Rabbi Hirsch is talking about shame, the way that Orot Tzadikim is talking about shame, and of course, Rabbi Rose, how do you understand busha, shame, through their eyes?
I think it's also, let's see.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, we hear you.
Oh, okay. I think it's also about self-awareness and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So it's sort of, a little kind of humility, shame, whatever, however you want to describe it, maybe makes us look inward and, and sort of, then know how to behave appropriately and maybe even more attuned to others as well. So it's also self-protection as I see it as well, that we don't embarrass ourselves, but we're also more attuned to others as well. And we look inward within ourselves.
Yeah. We see the embarrassed piece in
Yeah.
the way that they hid themselves. Adam and Eve
Mhm.
hid themselves,
Yeah.
right? Or in the way we say, ooh, that wasn't so good.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Jessica, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that too. Also, I think that shame and fear, which seems to be a corollary of shame, act as a brake on our actions, a brake.
I think
type
Jessica
of
got
break.
frozen.
And if it's sense of, pardon me?
Oh, you got frozen for a second. You said
Oh.
it was a break and then you stopped. Keep
Oh,
going.
yeah. Well, then I spelled the word because, not a break, but to restrain ourselves. And if we have self-awareness and a sense of shame, that may help us and to not do bad things, because it will bring shame and fear to us. Okay, enough.
So
thank
this busha, it's like the stopping point. Yeah, Frank.
And also like shame is like, I give a particular story. One time I watched a kid get bullied and I didn't help him. And I felt shame for not doing that. And I always thought the next time I see someone being bullied, I'm going to stand up for them because of the shame that I felt for so long over a little incident, so that type of shame.
So it's kind of like an internal nudge that is pushing you to be your best self in the future, to learn from the experience.
Mhm.
When you hear the word shame, I'm kind of curious, what kind of a connotation does that have for you? What is your association with it?
Negative. Embarrassed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very negative.
Mm.
Disgraceful, sort
Wow.
of not a pleasant, feeling for sure.
Yeah, and similarly, like I have a very negative association with the word shame. And so in preparing this Torah study and seeing how Rabbi Rose was marking shame, busha, as a soul trait, as something that we need to work on, personally, I've been struggling a little bit with that and trying to understand, what does busha really mean? Is shame the right word? And so you'll see in this Torah study coming up, there's going to be a few different texts, not quite yet, but coming up in a little bit, of trying to see if maybe the word that's used, maybe shame isn't really the right definition. Maybe it's something a little different than that, but it's getting to this internal conscience, perhaps, something that pushes us forward. Yeah, Jay, please.
Could it be more like embarrassment versus actual shame?
Yeah.
Because when we read this part of the Torah, I always think of how embarrassing it must have been for Adam and Eve to be naked in front of God. Just like sometimes we're embarrassed of actions that we do. And that was the first thing that came to my head, was maybe, I don't know the Hebrew in this one, but maybe the translation of shame could be a little more like embarrass.
It absolutely can, right? And if we make a correlation with that, what if we've been saying something a certain way for years, and then we find out that that language that we were using actually has a racist undertone to it that we hadn't known about? We might feel really embarrassed that we had known that phrase because we just weren't aware, right? But through that knowledge that we've now acquired, now we can go forward and we can do things differently in the future, right? There's lots, that almost might be a correlation with what happened in the Garden of Eden. They had been living a certain way, they had no shame, and then they came to a realization that, wait a second, walking around naked in a garden maybe isn't actually societally acceptable. And so let's figure out what to do from here, kind of a thing. But Misty, go ahead. You had something to say.
Yeah, so I agree with Jay in the sense that the scene is more of one of embarrassment. But if you look at the last sentence here, the trait of shame is a great fence and an iron barrier against all transgressions. So to me, shame in that sense it's what by cultivating that sense of shame, it's more like morality in the sense that I'm not going to steal that because it would bring shame on me. I'm not going to lie because it would bring shame on me. Or do you understand what so it's like, it's a very fine difference, but like Jay said, it's more of embarrassment in terms of the clothing. But if you were to look at shame in terms of sin, that relation with sin, and the comment there that it's so inherently in us, if we were to do a negative reaction, what would prevent us from doing that, right?
So you're saying it's more visceral. Yeah, Michael, did you have something you wanted to say too?
I was just thinking of something sort of maybe opposite, and maybe, the word ego and our ego in the sense of we are so important in our own minds, but, and maybe in the Garden of Eden, they thought that, they had it made, and all of a sudden they're in the presence of God, and they realize that they, this is the all-knowing, omniscient, omnipresent being, and as far as power, that they really weren't as powerful as maybe in their own minds they thought they were. And so as a result, they felt a bit shameful in what might have been what they would have been thinking in the past as compared to right now at this moment in time.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Let's hold on to that as we go forward. Let's kind of like grapple with that as we go into these other texts, because there's a few things coming up that I think do play with what you're saying, Michael.
Yeah.
Right. Can I mention one thing,
Yeah,
Rabbi?
go ahead.
I relate it to a loss of innocence. You're not shameful until you lose or gain knowledge of something that would make you shameful. So if you're childlike, as Adam and Eve, in my view, were childlike, and then all of a sudden they've gained this knowledge of maturity and human desire and things like that, and became knowledgeable about their bodies, then they can feel shame. Now, children can run around naked and not feel any shame, but at some point in time, after they're either taught or they come to some understanding, well, you're not supposed to do that, then they can feel somewhat awkward and then ultimately shameful.
So it's part of the evolution process. It's part of growing.
Right.
Even if it's uncomfortable. So let's turn to this week's portion. Let's bring in a verse from this week's portion, right? We made it 20 minutes without getting there, so let's get there. So it says, a person shall be impure as long as the disease is present. So essentially, when someone had Sarats, when someone had this scaly infection on their skin, they were taken out of the camp. We learned about that in last week's Torah portion. And the idea is that they're impure as long as this disease is still present, as long as the disease is growing. Being impure, that person shall dwell apart in a dwelling outside of the camp. So if someone has some sort of a disease that actually forces them to be separate, to be moved to a separate place, that might come with a sense of shame. And part of that is, as Rabbi Rose will talk about here, this connection, at least at this time, between disease and sin. That if you have this illness, it might be there because you did something wrong and this is a punishment. I don't believe that is actually true, that that's how things work. But it's kind of our starting point from this 1,000 years old text that we have. So let's look at what, sorry, go ahead.
Preparation for the pandemic. You get separated. I don't look at it that way. I think it's just the way for self-preservation. You didn't know what that was. And if you kept the person with everybody else, maybe everybody would get it. and it could wipe out your whole population. So yeah, I try to apply all these things in modern life, and going back to that spark of embarrassment or whatever. It's like, can we send these texts to Washington, D.C. for our politicians? Because sometimes I wonder how they can look in the mirror and don't have shame. And, these are supposedly quote unquote Christian people. So I struggle with all of this because it seems so lacking in many of the human beings that I see before me. And it just makes it really tough to grab. And why would we be ashamed of our naked bodies until we learn that there's something to be ashamed of? So, so I think I like it better when it was innocent and there was no shame for that kind of thing. And that's why little kids, until they're taught by their parents that you shouldn't be pulling your shirt up or doing whatever, I just, there's an innocence lost, I think, somehow with that.
Yeah. So it's really complicated. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just think that isolating for medical reasons is one thing. Putting shame on the person or people, making them feel badly about themselves, there's something wrong here about that. And so we need to separate those two things. And I understand that these are ancient times and they didn't have the knowledge of the kind of medicine we have today, obviously. So with knowledge, things did change, but this isolation and isolating is okay. But what bothers me is the shame and disgrace and making them feel badly about themselves.
Absolutely. And that was my response to the word shame, right? And that's why I brought in a few texts. Yeah, go ahead.
What about the isolation of menstruating women? That was, how could you shame somebody for a normal bodily reaction?
Yes.
Another monkey wrench.
Yeah, exactly. And that occurs within these Torah portions as well. I didn't bring that in here, but right, these are normal things. This is a part of everyday life. Why should there be shame in that? And so that's why I was questioning whether shame is really the right word. But sorry, you're right to bring in how this text, it's a little troubling, this correlation between, being separated and having that have something to do with sin. That, we look at COVID-19, for example, and I think when someone gets sick, what I've heard from people is there is sometimes a little bit of a feeling of shame. How could I have allowed myself to get sick? Even when intellectually we know that the disease is not, predictable, totally predictable, that you can do all the right things and there is a possibility of getting sick, right? But sometimes there's shame that goes along with that. These texts go beyond that because what they say is perhaps the reason that you got sick was that you did something wrong. And we know that very often that's not the case.
And also, if this sore is related to psoriasis, they didn't know about autoimmune diseases and they didn't have cortisone and stuff to treat it. So
exactly.
They thought it was bad. You could see these lesions on the skin. So, and that someone did something wrong to get them. So,
exactly.
Can I interject real quick?
Please do, Frank.
This is so describing the disease of addiction.
Really?
Separate people that are having trouble. You put them in rehabs. You put them in mental hospitals. This screams, because it's my personal story and I'm in recovery. This screams disease of alcohol or drug addiction, which is all back to ego and fear. So it's really reading a lot like that to me. You separate the people that are being drug addicts and alcoholics from the family because they're not doing well and they're making it harder in the house. So this reads to me about that. So just want to put that.
Interesting. And shame as well, factoring
Huge,
into that, right?
Huge shame, absolutely.
Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
My thought was, I'm just trying to think about why do I care? About why am I feeling shamed? And I kind of, look back at as humans, we have a need, for each other. We have a need to be, to be connected. And why is it painful? Because if we do something like that, we're going to be disconnected. And in tribal times, that was really bad. And, so I'm just, it seems to me that ultimately we want connection, we need connection, and we need to stay with our community and be accepted. And, that kind of drives some of the pain of the shame or even the embarrassment, I think.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really good point. Yeah, Jessica, go ahead.
Okay, I'm thinking, after what comes after shame? After shame comes repentance. And that's a really, really important activity and state of existence to be in, I think. And so that makes shame also important, because without it, there would be no repentance, says I, at least.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? It can't end with shame.
If
If the whole
so-
point of this is that, then we're missing something. Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
As wonderful as our language is, it does have has its flaws. The Greeks have about 5 or 6 different words for love. We only have one. I mean, you have to use other words to address what love really is. But they have a love, they have a passionate love for a spouse or a partner. They have a word for loving a parent or anyway. The Greeks have language that I think our language falls short here. I think if we were to try to work at it, we could come up with some words that are better than shame. Embarrassment was one mentioned already that I think would be better, but I'm sure everyone would come up with something a little different.
Yeah. And I want us to continue to grapple with that, because I think that's one of the bigger questions here is what really is meant there. Where's the positive in this? So let's look at this one text. This is also something that Rabbi Samuel Rose put in his Torah commentary. Rabbi Hirsch insists that if we look deeper into the meaning of the word nega and sarat, so here looking at this verse ahead, we have nega, and sarat, of course, is the name of this disease, the skin disease, right? Nega basically means impure. So if we look deeper into these words, we see that calling this particular collection of symptoms a disease in any sense is a misreading of the text. His definition also helps to explain why the person afflicted is exiled from the camp. Rabbi Hirsch explains, in the majority of cases where the word nega appears, it clearly refers to a disease that comes as a result of a special divine decree. A person afflicted with nega is negua, literally touched by the finger of God. Sarat, he says, denotes an inner rot that breaks out externally. The way that the nega serves God with respect to the mitzvah, this disease, may be linked to the way the question ayika serves God in relation to Adam. So we didn't talk a whole lot about this with the earlier text, but what happens, right? When Adam and Eve eat from the tree, God says, ayika, where are you? And of course, we don't know, we know that it's not God needing a GPS signal in order to figure out where they are, right? God knows where they are. And so if that's the case, what is the question really? It's more of an internal, where are you spiritually? Where are you emotionally? Where are you morally at this moment, right? This more large rhetorical question. So they say that Mitzvah is linked to this. God knows the spiritual location of the individual. It's the spiritual state that is rotten. The nega, like the question ayika, forces the affected individual to acknowledge that there is a problem. So if we read this, like you were talking about, Frank, with addiction, we can see this like this acknowledgement that something is not going right. And perhaps this is on a personal level if one of us is really struggling with an illness like that. Or perhaps this is a communal question when things in our society have gone rotten and we see the implications of that all throughout.
Well, I'm thinking back to last week a little bit, in last week's Torah portion, where we had the lesion Kohan Miriam, and we talked in the Torah study that I led over at Temple Israel last week on how maybe it was the fact that she said such negative things from her mouth about Moses, her brother, that caused the skin lesion to arrive. And I'm thinking it could be something similar here. That maybe we're not paying attention to what people are, we're not listening to what others are saying. We're being a little more, that's what I'm looking for. Just that we're more about ourselves and not thinking about others. And I think that's where one of the things that maybe they're going through here.
I have a question and thought, which kind of disturbs me. A person afflicted with a nega is a nagua, literally touched by the finger of God. What does that mean? Does it mean that God decrees that they become ill because they didn't somehow please God? I'm not certain why that is.
Yeah, I mean, that's the implication here. And it's a troubling one.
Yes.
I'm not discounting that at all. It absolutely is a troubling one. This is written at a time where people didn't have medical knowledge. And so trying to figure out why is something bad happening to this person? Well, it makes me feel better to know that the reason this bad thing is happening to this person is because they did something wrong. I just won't do something wrong and nothing will ever happen to me. But we know in real life, that's not how it works.
Right.
So it's almost like magical thinking.
It could be. And at the same time, we also know that there are societal things that if we don't take care of them, for example, right, even looking at COVID-19, there are some people who cannot get the vaccine for any number of reasons, or who get the vaccine, but their body can't hold on to immunity to it, right? But there's a huge population of people that can get it, but decided not to get it. And the disease would be so much more under control, so much quicker if only people had done that. That's evidence of some societal wrong that's leading to more illness. So sometimes we do have responsibility over some of the outcomes, but to look at a person who's sick and say, oh, it must be because you're bad, or you did something bad, that's not helpful. And that's also not true.
I think that comes from primitive stuff. We have sprinklings of primitive stuff all through the Torah.
Yeah.
It's just a hand-me-down from some kind of tribal religious thing, ancient history.
Absolutely.
And Rabbi, just, what you said, they didn't have the modern knowledge of medicine that we have now, but that's really true of many things. Like Frank was saying, until you have somebody in your close circle that has a drug addiction problem or has mental illness, you don't know what you don't know till you learn about it. So looking back at, the primitiveness here, it makes a lot of sense, but it's true of modern day for us as well. You only know what you know, and you make mistakes until you know how to do something or treat something differently. And so, it's very educational to me to be listening to this conversation, because I don't want to believe in a God who's, who caused me to light on fire and run across my yard on fire when I was 7 years old. I just can't, I can't grasp that.
Yeah.
And I know some people can, but for me, it's a no-go.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that in. Right.
I think it's bringing a discussion of being aware and also being open about all these different things, and I think that is so essential because it's very educational. And the more knowledge you have, the more your mind opens up. and you're not critical, and then compassion comes in. And I think that is so important to bring it out and talk about things. So what we're doing is great because we're talking about all these things.
Yeah, and a lot of times people ask me, when there are troubling things in the Torah, when there are things that are not fostering the kind of theology that we might think is helpful, why do we continue to study them? And I think this is why, right? Because we need to grapple them, because these ideas are in existence in our world, and they are in our past, and they're probably in the future as well. And we need to grapple within ourselves to kind of figure out what to do with them.
I think that's where Musar helps me a lot.
Yeah.
Without being introduced to that, I think I would have different feelings about it.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. That's fair. So let me take you into a couple more texts that talk about this idea of shame and why it is a midah, right? So this is a text from Nedarim. This is from the Talmud, where it says it is taught in a baraita, which is kind of like a commentary, that his fear may be upon your faces. This is referring to shame. So there's this text in Exodus right after we received the 10 Commandments saying that God's fear may be upon your faces. So keep the commandments because of God's fear. This is referring to shame, as shame causes one to blush, that you not sin, teaches that shame leads to fear of sin. From here, the sages said, it is a good sign in a person that he is one who experiences shame. Others say, any person who experiences shame will not quickly sin. And conversely, one who does not have the capacity to be shamefaced, it is known that his forefathers did not stand at Mount Sinai. So what is this really getting to, right? Like there's a few different things that are going on in here. This idea that it's a good sign if someone experiences shame because that person will not quickly sin. They know that it won't feel very good to do something that might bring them embarrassment or shame. But then the second piece, he who does not have the capacity to be shamefaced did not stand at Mount Sinai, was not part of Revelation. What do you make of that piece of it?
That's a pretty strong statement. The last
It
part.
is.
You know, it sounds like those who stood at Mount Sinai were chosen, according to what I'm reading here. Or if they weren't chosen, that they were chosen that they would be able to feel shame, and that you know, they are selected that way. I don't know, but very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, Misty, go ahead.
So it's sort of, to me, it's like it follows through on that concept of generational sin, you know, where it's passed on. So like, it's like if you weren't chosen, as she just said, then you wouldn't be a part of this, the chosen people of God, right? And if you didn't have shown any signs of shame, or if you showed that disease on your skin, you know how they used to do the curses from generation to generation, it would pass on. It's almost like it's tied in with that somehow.
I think that the choices that we have in life to not be sinful reside within us, and they are very important for us to recognize and to go to go down the path as often as we can. But as we said before, you know what happens in the world, it's a 4-letter word, and things happen even if we have chosen to follow the right path that are beyond our control. But this is life, in the way I see it.
Mm.
And back in my childhood, the one of the dramatic uses of that word was during the McCarthy era. McCarthy era when the senator said to McCarthy, or the lawyer said to McCarthy, "Have you no shame?"
Right. Yeah.
And it meaning that this guy could lie with a straight face and never blush or never winch. So that's what this is saying to me. So if you don't have the capacity to, or you portray that you're not shameful, then you just don't belong. I mean, it's a character trait that's bad.
Right. I mean, if we look at what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, right?
Yeah.
I don't
Right,
think Putin
yeah.
has very much shame. Yeah, Tom, did you want to say something? And then Ray, I saw you put something in the comments. I'm not sure if you wanted to say something as well.
I was just saying similar to what Irv was saying, is that I read that as if you don't have the capacity, from the Musar standpoint, from a lot of the other wisdom standpoint in the writings, shame has the effect of kind of guardrails to keep us in line, right? And doing the right things. And if you don't have the capacity to self-govern your conduct, then you're coming from the wrong school of thought. That's kind of how I interpret that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think that's really apt. Ray, is there something you wanted to say with this?
Well, my internet cut out. It's been terrible downstairs, so I lost what was said before. But this to me is such a harsh decree. I just think, you're raised in a family, and the family gives you values, and to think that you could be, down the river because your ancestor did something, your forefathers so long ago, I don't know, it just seems like a very harsh decree. I think, life, as Michael said, stuff happens, but for the most part, your parents raise you in a certain way. And yes, people do go, go off track from what they've been taught, but it just seems like a really harsh decree that I would be forever judged in my lifetime from something of my forefathers did. I don't know.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that sometimes rabbis talk at least in the Talmud, in these really paradoxical kind of ways. But part of what Mount Sinai is it's about community. This whole idea of busha, I think, is linked to our relationships with one another and the implications of our actions on one another. So this idea that if someone can't be shamefaced, if someone doesn't care about the implications on other human beings, that is essentially going against what the very revelation of Torah and the very thing that formed our people. So I know that's not exactly what it says here, but that's the message that I get from this. Let's go into one more text about this. This is also from the Talmud. And David said there are three distinguishing marks of this nation, the Jewish people. They are merciful, they are shamefaced, and they perform acts of kindness. They are merciful, as it is written in the Torah, and God will give you mercy and have mercy upon you and multiply you. Not only will God have mercy upon you, but God will bestow the attribute of mercy upon you. So this acts of loving kindness, of being merciful. They are shamefaced, as it is written, and that his fear shall be upon your faces. That the fear is on one's face is his shame. And again, that goes back to the text that we looked at earlier about observing the commandments, about acting in a moral and ethical way. And then they perform acts of kindness, as it is written, for I have known him, to the end that he may command his children and his household after him, that they must keep the way of the eternal, to practice righteousness and justice, to perform acts of kindness. So that these are the three central aspects of our people: having mercy, having shame, and performing acts of kindness. It's kind of an interesting thing. And it says, whoever has these three distinguishing marks is fit to cleave to the nations. But I wanted to bring in a little bit more. We started talking about this idea of shame. And whenever I think of shame, I think of Wow, I wrote Rabbi Brene Brown. She is definitely not a rabbi. In fact, I don't even think she's Jewish. But Brene Brown wrote in her, she has several different books. The most recent of one is Atlas of the Heart. And she talks about the difference between shame and guilt. And she wrote, shame is the intensely painful feeling of experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. So she's talking to this idea of shame as being one of putting ourselves down, of feeling unworthy. And if we look at shame through that kind of a perspective, that's not very productive or helpful, is it?
No.
Right? And that's part of what I've been wrestling with the translation of shame. In her book, I believe in the book Daring Greatly, she actually quotes this piece from Dan Ariely, which says, in a series of 3 experiments, participants were given a chance to claim unearned money at the expense of the researchers. There were 2 conditions in each experiment. The only difference between them was in the wording of the instructions. In the first condition, participants were told that researchers were interested in how common cheating is on college campuses, while in the second, they wondered how common cheaters are on college campuses. So what's the difference between saying how common cheating is versus how common cheaters are?
Well, I think when you hear cheaters are, it tells you, yeah, there's cheating going on. Where when you say how common cheating is, we're not sure how much cheating is going on, or even if there is cheating going on. Or in the second, it's saying it's sort of giving you the impression that there is cheating going on college campuses.
So it's stronger. Saying cheaters is like stronger language.
Yeah, cheaters are the people doing it. Cheating is the action of being dishonest.
Exactly. So that there's kind of a cheater being a classification of who someone is,
Right.
as opposed to an action that someone is doing, right? And it goes back to like, when a child does something wrong, do you say to that child, you are a bad kid because you did this? Or do you say to the child, you are a good person who made a mistake, let's fix it? There's a very big difference between the two.
Mm-hmm.
So then what happens in this study is it says this is subtle, but as it turned out, significant difference. Participants in the cheating condition claim significantly more cash than those in the cheater condition, who, similar to when we tempted people who have sworn on the Bible, did not cheat at all. This was true both in face-to-face and online interactions, indicating that relative anonymity cannot displace the implications of self-identifying as a cheater. People may allow themselves to cheat sometimes, but not if it involves identifying themselves as cheaters. So being a cheater comes with a sense of shame. Sometimes cheating doesn't have quite the level of shame attached to it, right? So when we feel shame, or when we have that, it can stop us in our tracks. And yet there can be this really negative implication.
It's,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, it's labeling. It's labeling people. And when you're labeled, it really diminishes your self-worth and is extremely destructive.
Yeah. So then the question becomes, how do we have this soul check? How do we actually allow ourselves to feel the vulnerability, the calling, and even the embarrassment that comes with making a mistake and realizing that we hurt someone? How do we own that, but own that in a way that actually can lead to positive change in the future, as opposed to us just beating ourselves up now? Because that doesn't do any good for anyone, right? So there's a few quotes. These are just little sporadic quotes from some of Brene Brown's writings that she says what's interesting is that guilt gets a really bad rap. But guilt is a very socially adaptive emotion. Guilt is, I did something bad, and shame is, I am that. I am a cheater. I am a liar. I am whatever the X is, right? Guilt is cognitive dissonance. Guilt says, I've done something or failed to do something that is aligned with my values, and it feels awful. I need to make amends, to make a change, and to hold myself accountable, I need to fix it. In short, Brene Brown is, as a non-Torah scholar, perhaps giving us an idea that maybe busha isn't so much about shame, but rather about guilt, which can propel us to live into our highest values. Maybe that's another way of kind of looking at this.
But it's interesting because if you feel guilt about doing something that you know would be good to do, but it's going to harm you or make it really hard for you, then it's hard to differentiate those two things. Because I have a relative who has bipolar sister-in-laws, and she knows sometimes what she should do, but doing it will bring her so far down that she will avoid doing that. That doesn't mean anything bad. She's just trying to protect herself because it's so difficult. So it's so hard to make these statements just apply to everything. And not that they're meant to, but it strikes me hearing that.
I think that's such a good point, Ray, right? Like these texts that we have, they're kind of amorphous. They're outside of specific circumstances. And we can't just apply this to everything because there's lots of extra factors. And we all just have to make the best calls that we can, going by what our conscience tells us and what we need to do for both self-preservation and for the good of people around us.
Can I say something?
Please do, Irv. Go ahead.
I'm having a little trouble coming to the words in this concept, but we do it because it's our culture. I mean, this is what we're talking about, our culture here, and we're talking about Torah and the mitzvot and that thing. If you go to another culture, one I studied about this subject was Japanese people. They take their religion kind of casually. That's the way the author of the book I read was. But they take faith-saving and shame they bring to their family as really serious stuff to the point of suicide.
Yeah.
So it's what's behind it that counts. So okay, I broke a mitzvah. I'll go make a contribution to something and absolve myself. It's an easy way to get out. So it's how serious you are about what it is you believe and what really drives us and motivates us.
And where we go with it from there. Yeah. Thanks, Irv. Jessica, go ahead.
Irv brought up one example of another culture. Yet another example is honor killing in Islam. If a woman brings shame upon her family by marrying, for example, a non-Muslim or not wearing a hijab, she is likely to be killed in order to restore honor to the family and to purge the shame from it.
In very, very, very extremist cases, right? Yeah, and I think a lot of cultures have things like that in it.
I think that guilt brings on reflection, and it doesn't make you feel badly about yourself necessarily. I think it causes reflection, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing to think about what transpired, and learn from it.
What we would do if we knew we never got caught.
Or maybe we wouldn't because of that internal moral compass, right?
I had an accountant in Alabama who said that I ran this kind of informal survey about people who came in to get a tax preparation. He said, if I can guarantee you will not be audited, and I put this in here, I can get you back $1,000. And he said 99% of the people said no to that. And so just made an impression on me.
Yeah. So I would say that to go back over this as it's coming up, the shame is something that I feel. Guilt is knowing that, and shame can be like we're talking about cheaters. A great example is I'm going to cheat because I think they're cheating too, right? And that makes it right for me in my head. But that, and then I feel shameful for it. But guilt is admitting, hey, I cheated, right? So there's like this thing, like shame is something that I'm feeling. But if I have guilt, that means I'm kind of like, you're guilty. I'm admitting, yeah, I did do these wrong things, instead of justifying it and saying, well, everybody else is cheating, so I might as well cheat too. That's kind of what I was.
Yeah, so there's a responsibility that comes with it. There's a constructiveness that comes with it, because it's saying, yep, I'm doing something wrong. That's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. Now it's on me to fix that, right? It's very, very different.
You know, when my daughter was applying to college, she knew several people who embellished their resumes for applications. And she said, it's so not fair, because how do you compete with that? And I said, you know what? But at night, when you lay your head on your pillow, you knew that you were honest. And, you know, that's all you can do. And I'm glad you chose to be honest. And, you know, again, some people think there's no problem with doing that it's okay. Or some people think it's, you know, I think maybe the IRS might be feared more than God. And so people, you know, will only go so far to go off the mark, because it's people like we normal, average American citizens who would get caught, not somebody, a big embezzler or whatever. So it's a very interesting thing. And I know when I was younger, I don't know, I got too much change back from something and I took it back because it really bothered me. And the person, the teller was there, the checker was so like shocked that anybody would do that. It's just so interesting, the expectations we have of people, to be honest. And it's kind of sad.
So I was just thinking, so the way we view Judaism and is doing the action of doing right and helping others and whatever, but I'm just wondering, do the ultra Orthodox who only study the Torah and perhaps don't in their lives do much to improve things, do they feel shame in any way?
Well, Torah is supposed to, if you remember in our Torah service, right?
Yeah.
It's saying like, what is the most important mitzvah? And the idea is, well, it's the mitzvah of Torah. Why? Because it leads to all of the other ones. If we're serious about studying Torah and investing ourselves in all of this, then how could it not spill out if we let it, right? If we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and truly are studying Torah, not just with our minds, but also with our hearts, then how could it not also spill over into creating generosity, to being kind, to being more in line with our values? And that's not to say that every single individual does that all the time, because we don't. All of us make mistakes. Some of us miss the mark, or all of us miss the mark sometimes, I should say, not some of us, all of us. But really, I mean, that's what it's there for, right?
Well, how about the Haredi or whatever they're called?
Same there. They study the same texts.
But in Israel, you know, disallowing women to practice Judaism in certain locations.
So I think it's really important to recognize that there's lots of different cultural things, right?
Right.
And that we're members of this community because we have a value of egalitarianism that isn't shared by everyone. That doesn't mean that a group is immoral because their culture is different from ours. It just means maybe that's not the right place for us.
Okay. Thank you.
But as we close this out, because I'm recognizing it's 2:00 and I had a few texts we haven't gotten to, I encourage you to look at them. There are some beautiful ones. But I want to end with this one from Midrash Tanchuma because I just love it. And it says, when you set up the lamps, to what is the matter comparable? To a king who had a friend. The king said to him, "You should know that I am dining with you, so make it ready for me." Now, context, the king is God. The average person, just an average person, right? So his friend went and prepared a commoner's couch and a commoner's table. And when the king arrived, attendants came with him. They sat around, menorahs of gold before him on the other side. And when his friend saw all the splendor, he felt ashamed and concealed everything that he had prepared, because everything was of the type used by commoners. The king said to him, "What is this? Did I not tell you that I was dining with you? Why did you not prepare anything for me?" And his friend said to him, "My lord king, when I saw all the splendor that came with you, I felt ashamed and concealed everything that I had prepared before you, as it consisted of commoners' utensils." And the king said to him, "By your life, I am rejecting all of my utensils, which I have brought with me, out of love for you, and I only wish to use yours." What's the moral of this, right? Every single one of us is flawed. We all make mistakes. We all do things that at times we're not proud of, right? And as we learn from our Torah portion, sometimes that's a good thing because it can actually push us to be better versions of ourselves. But we don't need to be perfect in order to have God's love. We don't need to be perfect in order to make a feast set for a king, because God can see the good in us. And if we can approach things with humility, if we can allow ourselves to feel the vulnerability of our actions on other people, then that is some of the most holy stuff that we can do. So I encourage you to look through a few more of these texts. There's a lot of different things here. And I'm just so grateful for all of your wisdom, for all the time that all of you took to be here today and exploring this midah and exploring this particular Torah portion. I know that last week I was at a conference, and so I wasn't here for Torah study. This next week, I'm actually going to be on vacation. I wasn't sure if I was going to be off on Thursday, but I am. I'm going to be off right before Passover starts. So there's not going to be Torah study next Thursday, but I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks when we will be able to dive into the portion around Passover.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Have a great vacation.
Yes.
Thank you.